conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to an amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, this is the last episode going out on the radio and TV that is before this Tuesday's election. So I thought it'd be a great time, great opportunity for us to go through some of these races, some of these ballot initiatives. So we'll be going through races in the state legislature, and also we'll be talking about Amendment 2. And the races we're going to be paying attention to are ones that are getting some attention from those in the political spheres, those who are looking at it. So we're going to have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, please, if you are listening to this on the TV or radio, checking it out, and you say, you know what, I like what this guy has to say, I want to hear more about it, you can head over to theandrewshow.com and check out the podcast that comes out more than just once a week, comes out several times a week, up to 5 times a week if we're having a good week to be able to get out the information. But you can stay up to date on exactly what's going on right here in Kentucky. So please head on over to theandrewshow.com. Also, if you want to reach out to the show, you can hit the contact tab there, leave a message for the show. You can also email the show at info@theandrewshow.com. So let's dig down into it. So we're going to be looking at House District 45. That's that open seat that Killian Timoney had, that Thomas Jefferson beat him in the primary, and now it's Thomas Jefferson versus Adam Moore. We'll check that out at the end. We'll look at House District 56 first, though, held by Daniel Pfister. We'll then head over to Senate District 27 that Steve West currently holds. We'll also take a look after that at the 31st House District up in Louisville, held by Susan Tyler Winton. And we'll also look at the 88th House District race where incumbent Sherilyn Stevenson is taking on Vanessa Grossell, Democrat incumbent Sherilyn Stevenson. So we're going to cover those races, but before I dig down into that, I want to tell you how I look at races. How do I look at the data here? And I'm looking at a few things. One, I'm looking at voting trends. I'm trying to draw what conclusions I can from prior year data, from seeing what the trend of data has been. Also, I'm looking at things like how much money's being dumped into the race, where the money's coming from as well. If the individual just has like a lot of money, well, that just tells you maybe they have a lot of rich friends, or they have a fair amount of money themselves they're dumping into it. It doesn't necessarily talk about how much resources and how good that person's doing in the race. But when you start seeing the establishment dumping in a fair amount of money into a race, when you're seeing like Democrats, for an example, dumping 50, 60K right from their caucus campaign accounts into certain races, well, that tells you that that race has probably been polled, and they're seeing that it is very close, or the Democrat is actually doing better than the Republican, and it is worthwhile for them to spend some money taking down that incumbent, winning that seat. And so that's part of what I look at when I look at fundraising and monetary trends, and I'm also looking at down ballot performances that go on in these districts. See, this is a mistake, and you might hear me reference this a few times today, that I've seen a lot of the Democrats make. And they're trying to look at how Beshear performed and then trying to decide whether or not that's a good idea for them to look at those districts. And I think that is completely mistaken. You cannot look at a top of the ticket incumbent Democrat in an off-year election and decide whether or not a district is viable for you. What you need to be looking at, if you're going to glean any information from what happened in a district in 2023, you need to be looking at the down ballot races. You need to be looking at their default races, because the fact of the matter is, and this is something that is really hard for anybody in the political circles to admit to themselves, is that generally speaking, the voters who are going to turn out and vote on a presidential election year do not care about your state house race. They do not care about your state senate race. They really don't. And it's really hard to get them to even pay attention to it. And what you're trading in is the margins. You're talking about 4 to 5%, maybe the electorate, that is actually going to be swayed by what you're doing, because the vast, vast majority of them are going to show up, vote for who they're going to vote for at the top of the ticket, and then when they work down ticket, vote for the same person. That's why it's called a coattail effect with down ticket. That's how the Republicans flipped the House for the first time in 2016 to begin with, is because Trump was on the ballot. Trump did so well. He drove out so many voters that there's a big coattail effect that really helped bring up the rest of the ticket. But the Democrats have decided to look at a top of the ticket off your election race, Bashir, and pin their hopes and dreams on it. And that is seriously a mistaken thing to do, because even in those off year elections where you have a Democrat at the top of the ticket that could win over people, you look in some of these races and you'll see that places where Bashir won with 20, 25 points, the Republicans down ticket still won, because it's what I call a default R or default D district. Unless you can grab a hold of their attention and get them to look at your race, they're going to end up just voting to a default position. And in many of these districts, it's a default R. And truthfully, when it's a top of the ticket race going on that's so grabbing so much media attention, like we're seeing with the presidential election or we see the governor election, individuals, they're not paying enough attention to move off their default in most situations in order to go ahead and vote down ticket differently than they're doing at the top at the ticket. And another thing I need to remind you as we look at these races is redistricting occurred. So in 2020, there was races, but then in 2022, for those races, they redistricted the districts and made them more as a Republican legislature, so in a lot of circumstances, they would have made them more conservative, not less, if it's being held by an incumbent Republican, but the Democrat incumbent districts probably got more Democrat, more liberal, more safe as they moved voters, because, they're drawing those lines. And so they're trying to move. So if I can move some Democrat voters off into this person's district and somehow draw, because, voters are in pockets, somehow draw in more Republicans into this district to make it a safer district for our incumbent there, if we like them, well, then that's a good move. Now, if we don't like the incumbent, maybe we make it harder on them to win. And so that becomes an interesting dynamic too, as we're looking at these races. But let's start off first talking about the Amendment 2 on the ballot there, because that is also being voted on Tuesday, and it is statewide. Now, it's hard to figure out exactly how that ballot's going to do. Now, I've talked to a few members of the pro school choice side, the people fighting for the amendment to pass, and they say that it's pretty tied as far as the polling goes. They're looking at it, they're saying, look, it seems like it's pretty even split. We're maybe up by 2-3 points, but it's very close. But their concern is there's a large amount of undecided voters when it comes to Amendment 2. And that is a problem for those who want to see the amendment pass. Now, obviously, that decision gets made better as people advance and get closer to, but there's a default no. So I talk about default R districts, default D districts. There's a default no that everybody has when it comes to any kind of referendum questions. Anything that deals with, of course, raising taxes, but anything that deals with constitutional changes, it's a default of a no. Somebody has to push on it. I mean, let's rewind to 2022, where Amendment 2 on the ballot dealt with an abortion question. It wasn't even asking about whether you believe in exemptions or anything else. What it was asking you was, there is no right to an abortion in the Constitution. Now, there is not a right in our state constitution to an abortion right now. It was just reaffirming what's already in the Constitution to make sure rogue judges don't somehow read in rights that don't exist. That's exactly what happened with Roe v. Wade at the national level, so they're trying to make sure it doesn't happen at the state level. But despite that, and despite being a relatively conservative state, and despite just reaffirming there's no right to an abortion in the Constitution that already isn't there, the amendment lost, what did it lose by? It lost 47.65% saying yes and 52.35% saying no. And that's because it was a default no, but also there was nobody with those deep pockets pushing on the other side. With Amendment 2, you have exactly the opposite. You do have people with deep pockets. So we'll finish up our discussion on that and then start digging into some races. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, we were talking about Amendment 2. First, is it going to pass? Is it not? I was talking about some insider polling data I'm privy to that says it's pretty close. However, there's a lot of undecideds, and how are they going to fall? And I was talking about how Amendment 2 in 2022, the abortion amendment failed, but a big reason why it failed is because there wasn't a lot of money on the yes side of things, and there was a lot of money on the no side of things, because you had Planned Parenthood pushing out, shaping people's belief, and on the yes side, you really only had maybe a campaign. I don't know exactly how much they raised, but let's say on the high side, $1 million, that was mainly based upon grassroots efforts and pro-life grassroots efforts. Compared to the other side, you had Planned Parenthood, you had every Democrat organization, every grassroots organization throwing in money, and you had millions on one side versus maybe $1 million on the other, and that really affected it. But despite all that, it still came out with right around 47% of the vote. But this year, Amendment 2, getting it passed, the pro-school choice, you actually have a pretty good chunk of change on the other side, millions of dollars. Now, on the no side, they have dumped a good chunk of change. I believe the NEA, National Education Association itself, has dumped $5.5 million into the no campaign. But all in, they maybe have 6 to 7 million based upon what I've been seeing. But on the yes side of thing, we've seen expenditures up around $10 million. And it's interesting that this dump has happened and how they're kind of advertising it, because I know at my household in Lexington, now granted, I'm going to show up as a hard Republican. When you probably look at your data, I'm going to show up as a 4 out of 4 voter. I'm going to show up as somebody who shows up to vote, and I'm going to be shown as a pretty strong Republican. So maybe they're not targeting me, which seems odd, because if there's any hard Republicans that you're going to get to vote no on this amendment, you would think it would be more the more liberal Republicans, which tend to be in the metro areas like Lexington, like Louisville. Obviously, I'm not one of them, but depending on how you're looking at your data and tracking it, looks a lot different. But that being stated, putting that to the side here, I have gotten probably a mailer every single day telling me to vote yes on Amendment 2, but I don't think I've gotten a single one telling me to vote no. So it does have a good chance of passing, but if it does fail, it's in large part because the no side, it wasn't as much funding, but they were able to weaponize the school districts themselves, the school systems, illegally, might I add, because we have I talked about this last week or Thursday. I talked about this Thursday, where we have a attorney general that isn't enforcing the law at all. We've seen flagrant violations of Kentucky statutes that say you cannot expend taxpayer funds in order to push a yes or no vote on an amendment, and our attorney general has done nothing. So if it does fail, it'll be because, especially if it was close, the fact that our attorney general allowed the schools to get away with violating state law and individuals to get away with violating state law in the process and not prosecuting them will be a big part of the reason why. And I don't think that could be understated. So enough though about Amendment 2. I've talked about it a lot leading up into this election, of course, as well. Let's start digging into some of these other races. And we're going to start off in House District 56. Now you see I got some papers in front of me if you're watching me on the video format. Sorry if it seems like I'm looking down a little bit, but we're going to be talking about some numbers, and I have them here on this paper, and they're big number, well, not super big, but there are a lot of percentages and tens of thousands of registrants and things like that, and it's hard to obviously remember all that. So I'll have my notes here. So House District 56 is currently held by Dan Pfister. And I've heard rumblings about this race in the backgrounds that, it's in danger. And they believe that Dan Pfister, and this is what I've heard from kind of the more establishment or tied into the establishment or more in tune with the establishment individuals and current elected officials, is that the rumblings are that Dan Pfister hasn't worked very hard and he's now in trouble in House District 56, which is a bit surprising to me that Dan Pfister, Representative Pfister, hadn't been working is the claim because, well, he ran for that seat, I believe, 2 times before he finally got it. So it's the 3rd time's the charm, and he ran in 2020 is when he finally picked it up. And I think we need to go over the registration of the district. So in 2020, when Pfister first won the district after running 2 other times, the district had 19,115 registered Ds in it and 13,789 registered Rs. and independents and others made up about another 3,000. Now, it's kind of amazing that he won. He won with 52% of the vote against the Lamar Allen, who raised 88,000. Pfister had 90,000. They're pretty evenly matched when it comes to the actual monetary side of things. But now with redistricting having occurred, the district does look better for Republicans. It does look better for Pfister because right now the district sits at 15,935 Democrats and 17,228 Republicans and about 3,500 others, whether that's independent or others or what have you. So that's a pretty big flip because what we've seen here now is the Democrats go down because of redistricting mainly, but also they're just not advancing as fast as Republicans in registration. We're seeing the Democrats go down about 4,000 in registrants while Republicans went up about 4,000. That's a pretty big flip. It went from a 5,500 voter D edge when he first won in 2020 to a 1,300-ish R edge. And I also like to look at registration trends. And what registration trends tell us is since the primary this year, which that kind of tells us how excited the people in the district are to vote. Are they more excited to vote D or are they more excited to vote R? And what we've seen is the Democrats have increased their registration by 0.13% since primary, and ours, on the other hand, have gone up 2.8%. So far outstripping that of what the Democrats are doing, telling me that the Republicans in the district and people in the district in generally are more excited to vote Republican. So you've got a better registration position than you got 4 years ago. Trump's approval rating, by the way, is also now 4 years greater than it was in 2020. In 2020, it was 43% in November as the election was happening. Right now, according to Siena College, it's around 48 to 49%. So Pfister won on the Trump wave that happened in Kentucky, that we saw Republicans grabbing a hold of the legislature back in 4 years ago when he had lower approval ratings than he had now. And I do think people in Kentucky are going to be more excited to turn out and vote because we see that Donald Trump is pretty much neck and neck with Kamala. He was behind. But when you look at the enthusiasm, they're also pretty neck and neck. But that's on a national level. Let's look at what do you think's going on here in Kentucky, where people know Trump is going to win. Do you think that Democrats are going to turn out at the same levels as Republicans when they know that their candidate at the top of the ticket's going to lose? Are they going to be as enthusiastic? They're not. And we know this because in 2020, after 2016, where Trump had that blowout in Kentucky for the first time that Trump was on the ballot, we see that Republican turnout in the state was a whole 5 points higher than Democrat turnout. Let me ask you, do you think Republicans or Democrats are more excited to turn out than they were in 2020? I think Republicans are more excited to turn out. Their guy isn't in office. They're voting against something, not just for something. And so this doesn't seem like a very competitive race to me. It seems like Pfister should kind of have it. Now, it's possible. It could be for a few reasons. Maybe the Dems are seeing something in the district, that many of these districts they see something in, which is obviously the Beshear effect, that if Beshear won the district in 2023, they think somehow a Democrat down ticket could win it come 2024. However, once again, it is not comparable. You cannot compare an off-year top of the ticket to a down ticket presidential year. Those are two totally different races, even if they're being had in the same district. You need to look down ticket if you're trying to figure out and draw any conclusions out of 23 to what you can see this year. It is just not comparable. However, Pfister, I'm hearing, may have hurt himself, where if he does lose, it's because maybe he thought he was coasting in. He was going to be fine after redistricting. He won by, maybe a pretty good amount 2 years ago against somebody that worked pretty hard. Maybe he did not work super hard. Maybe he thought to himself, I have this in the bag, nothing to worry about, and he's now starting to come in too late. Because remember, in 2020, when he had that race, he raised right around $90,000. Well, right now, as an incumbent, so you should always be able to raise more money as an incumbent than you were as the person out of office, right? Because you work your same contacts, you're now in office. And you're a winner. People always want to support a winner. Those people who said no to you before maybe didn't give as much as they could. Well, they're going to double down. They're going to give you even more and continue to support you. And you're going to bring in now new voters as well. However, Pfister's only raised $33,000 himself. But now, because he's an incumbent, he has about another $30,000 coming from the establishment PACs and caucus campaign committee directly into his campaign. But that is still $30,000 less than he was in 2020 when he first won the seat. That does indicate maybe he hasn't been trying too hard to raise money and go out there and campaign. Not to mention, of course, we've had independent expenditures on his side as well. Now, when we look at his opponent, one Chantel Bingham, we see a $40,000 raise, which doesn't seem like a lot. We don't see any direct help from the Democrat Caucus Campaign Committee into her accounts or establishment PACs. And part of that could be because they poll, P-O-L-L, sorry, not pool, poll these things. And they could be seeing something a whole lot different than what they're rumbling about. I mean, I remember the Republican establishment in general. I always wonder about their polling. I do have some questions about that. That'll probably come up, though, as we talk about some of these other races that we have to look at. Coming up after this, we're going to talk about the Steve West versus Molly Crane poll. We're going to have that after this race going on in Senate District 27. We'll have that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, we were digging into Dan Pfister facing on Chantel Bingham. Now we're going to be moving on to Steve West in the Senate District 27 facing down a Molly Crane. Now, before the break, I alluded to the fact that I always had questions about establishment polling. How do they arrive at their conclusions? And I say that because I've heard a lot of weird things out of establishment when it comes to polls. For an example, during the primary this year, I heard them say things like, Killian Timoney was going to win, that Thomas Jefferson was done, and it turned out to be a blowout for Thomas Jefferson, so clearly their polling was off. Their political instincts, a lot of time of the establishment too, I do not find it to be particularly well. I don't think they spend enough time talking to grassroots, talking to voters. Obviously they don't, because, if they did, they'd find out that people greatly disagree with a lot of things they believe, and so they want to insulate themselves from it. So as the establishment and these politicos have insulated themselves from actual people and have retreated into their bubble, they've kind of lost a lot of their natural instincts to understand what's going on with the electorate. That's part of why they poll literally everything. They poll everything. They poll, what do we want to talk about? What do people care about? What hits? What doesn't? And they have no natural instincts about it, and they spend a lot of money on it. And then their polls end up coming back with all kinds of weird results sometimes because, it's hard to draw too many conclusions. You have response bias. You have a lot of things that happen, especially from small polls. I mean, if you're trying to poll a House race, for an example, how many people are you talking to? How many people are you asking? Did the response rate match the registration of the district? I mean, all kinds of questions. And so it does lead me to wonder how they arrive at their information. But now we have the Steve West versus Molly Crane race in Senate District 27. Now, this is an interesting race, let me tell you, because if we rewind in this race to 2016, Steve West wins with 67% of the vote in 2016. And the makeup of the district at that time was 49,060 Democrats to 29,723 Republicans. How does that happen? How do you have a full-on 20,000 registered voter difference in a Senate district between Democrat and Republicans, but yet Republicans won the race? Well, first, you had Trump on the ballot, and that led to a pretty significantly higher turnout. In fact, when you look at actual registration, you see that Republicans turned out in a pretty significant amount in 2016. And now Trump's on the ballot again. And 2020, they turned out. And so Trump's on the ballot again. And what does that district look like now, 8 years later? Well, what we see here is that Democrats have 46,219 people registered in the district. And now Republicans have 38,760. So Democrats went down about 3,000. Meanwhile, Republicans went up about 9,000. That's a big swing. It cut the voter gap over half, where now it's less than 10,000 registered Republican voters over Democrat, or Democrat voters over Republican. And that's also where I want to point out that the Ds are a little, I think, crazy to think about these down ticket the same as the top ticket. Because once again, that would tell you that's a district that should be really great. I mean, Joe Biden should be able to win that district, or Kamala Harris should be able to win that district, but they won't. It'll go heavy R. And that there's a weird thing that's happening in rural areas where people, especially low propensity voters, may be registered Democrat because they never bothered to change because they don't vote in the primaries. But when Trump's on the ballot, they will turn out to vote. And that can now give wins in some pretty weird positions. And Democrats this is my point, they should have kept their powder dry. What they should have done is kept their powder dry and hoped, if you're a Kentucky Democrat, hope that Trump wins. So that way, come midterms, it favors the party that's not currently in power. You should have hoped that Trump wins the House, Trump wins the Senate, that Republicans win the House, the Senate, and Trump wins at the national level. You have them for 2 years. So that way the midterms become a referendum on them. A lot of times the party not in power turns out at higher rates. And that's when you should have expended your money in some of these races. You should not have blown your powder, your gunpowder, right? Your spending on these races with Trump on the ballot, because you're going to have weird things happen like in these races. And so let's look at the fundraising here for the Senate race. We got Molly Crane at $149,000 raised. Pretty good penny here. Now, Steve West, those raised $136,000. However, I've gotten a lot of mail from GoPax and RPK. For an example, take a look at this that I got in the mail yesterday. Now, those of you who are not watching this on video can't see, but I'm holding up a piece of mail that is larger than a piece of paper. This is, for reference, here's a 9.5 by 11 piece of paper. It is significantly larger than that. Now, anybody, and it's full color, both sides, anybody who, and this is paid for, by the way, by the GoPac. GoPac paid for this, which is a Republican, PAC, that's all. Now, anybody, though, who at all does mail knows a type of piece like this, bigger than a standard piece of paper, is very, very expensive. But there's also a little pro tip for anybody who is doing mail, by the way. If you keep your mail smaller, when you have people like me who sign up for the USPS email alerts, where I see what mail I'm getting that day sent to me via email images before I even get the mail. If you have that kind of size piece of mail right there that I just showed you, they're not going to be able to scan that in. If it's a bit smaller, they'll be able to scan it in and it'll still show up in your email. So you kind of get two touches. You get that email in the morning where they see it, and then when they go to their mailbox and pull it out, they'll see it. Though that size piece of mail, they're kind of guaranteed to see it. They literally have to wrap that around the rest of your mail to get it to fit. So they're spending a lot for him. I've seen the Republican Party of Kentucky spending a lot of money too as well, making sure that Steve West holds on to that. So who will win? I do think Steve West will here. The district's only gotten better for him. Historically, it's performed very well for him with Trump on the ballot. And here's the other thing too. Molly Crane hasn't sent anything to me at all. And you have to court the R voters at least a little bit. I mean, that's what Beshear did. Keep in mind, when Beshear wins in a district, and they say, well, Beshear won that district. The reason why Beshear won in that district, part of it was he heavily courted Republican voters, even hard R Republican voters like myself. And they were able to peel off some percentages. But if you're not going to do that, you're not going to win at all in a district where Trump is winning by such high percentages. Because you need to message on some conservative things and you also need to send it to Democrats too, because you have a lot of conservative, low propensity Democrats that may turn out to vote that will vote for Trump because they are conservative, and if you're not messaging on anything conservative at all, they're just going to default R down the ballot there. Well, coming up after this, we'll go over the 31st House district. Also, in that Senate district, Republican turnout was better as well. So that's pretty important to note. So after this, we'll go over the 31st House district with Susan Tyler Whitten. 3 names. I talked about this, I think, last week on my show, but this 3-name thing, women in politics and having 3 names just drives me crazy. Anyways, Susan Tyler Whitten, Republican incumbent, has been in for 2 years, first one in 2022, facing down against Colleen Davis. Now, this one might be one Democrats flip. You'll hear what I have to say about that after this short break. As always, if you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back here in this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I've been going through some competitive races, just some numbers and data behind them. I've got 3 more I want to cover that I talked about covering initially, and I hope we get through them. So we're going to try to rattle through these as quick as possible. So we have Susan Tyler Whitten. This is where I think the D's might pick up a race because Whitten won in 2022. She got 52% of the 52% of the vote to 48% of the Democrats. Now, the registration in 2022 was Democrats had 18,441 and Republicans had 16,002 registered voters. Now, here is why she won in 2022 when we look at turnout. Democrat, remember what I said about off year? So this time we had Democrats had general control in the presidency too as well, in the House, in the Senate, and so there was a quote-unquote red wave. And while it didn't happen nationally, it did happen locally here in Kentucky. And we see this here in this Susan Tyler Whitten race, because in 2022, you had Democrat turnout of only 30% and Republican turnout of 39%. That means you had 5,532 Democrat voters to 6,240 Republican voters. So that turnout in this case really mattered. That's why I always say to individuals as we're talking about bringing in voters and everything else, turnout is really key. Now, if you're not top of the ballot, nobody's turning out for you. They're turning out for who's ever at the top, of course. So it's really hard, unless your name is Donald Trump, to turn out people for you. But most campaigns are about turnout, and you get good turnout by having a really good ground game leading up to those election days. Make sure you're getting people out to vote and reminding them you exist. And a good ground game, I think, is worth a few points because it might drive a few people out. But regardless, we see the Republicans had 62,040 votes. Now, ours made up, just Democrat versus Republican, 53% of the voters. So she actually lost 1% of the R to D split. So now we're in a presidential election year, not an off year. So the best way for us to kind of look at the district, now granted, of course, we've had redistricting and everything else, but we'll go back to look at 2020 results. And what do we see? Turnout in the district was 68% Democrat, 65% Republican. So almost over double Democrat turnout compared to what it was before. And Republicans, on the other hand, not quite double. Democrats actually turned out at a higher rate. Now, obviously, it's been redistricted, so it's hard to see exactly what that district would look like now, but it doesn't look good because when we look at the 2024 registration, we're still seeing Democrats 17,980 registered voters compared to Republican 15,692 registered voters, which is interesting because they both lost voters compared to 2022. They both have lost individual in their party. I mean, the Democrats have lost about 500 or so voters in that district, and the Republicans have also lost about 400 or so, but Republicans are already lower, so it's a pretty equal split. So if they turn out at the same, and she gets the same vote share she did in 2022, but they turn out at the same rates as the district did, though once again is redistricted in 2020, she loses. And for that reason, I do think she's going to lose. Now, the Republicans are doing everything they can to stop it. According to Susan Tyler Whitten's KREF, she's got $209,000 raised. Plus, what the party has thrown in, which is pretty crazy. But on the other side, her opponent has $123K personally raised, and the party's thrown in some money too. But you have to overcome apathy when you're dumping this money. To get D's to come over to R's, you got to get them to pay attention again to your race. More Democrats turn out to vote. It's going to be a hard time for them because they got to convince D's to cross ticket. So let's say you do have 5% of the vote that's in play, and we expect around 22,500 total voters. Well, 5% is 1,125 voters at the same turnout levels as 2020. You have 2,026 more D's than R's. So you have to win over every single swing voter and every single independent if they turn out at the same levels in order to be competitive if you're Susan Tyler Whitten. And I think that's a big part of the struggle here. That's a big part of the apathy. Now let's turn to a Democrat incumbent seat where they're trying to defend. That's the 88th, held by Sherilyn Stevenson, and she's facing off against Vanessa Grossell. Now, anybody who listens to the show knows I do not like Vanessa Grossell. I think that is a race where, I'd tell you, if you have that on your ballot, Sherilyn Stevenson versus Vanessa Grossell, I'm telling you, you should probably just not vote. Because Vanessa Grossell is literally... She's a Democrat. She's got an R next to her name, but she was literally a delegate for the Democrat Party but just a few years ago. Like, that's how involved she was, and I've mentioned this before, I've gone over it, and putting an R next to somebody's name means they can pass bills, it means they can chair committees, it means they can get things done. If we're going to have Democrat policies in a supermajority Republican legislature, we'd rather have those policies have a D next to their name instead of an R because they're ineffective as a D. And that's why I'd prefer personally that Sherilyn Stevenson win this race. But of course, for the same reason, I'd rather Grossell take the loss in this district. The establishment Republicans want her to win, and they are spending some big money for her out of GOPAC. Now, granted, part of GOPAC's state-level leadership here in Kentucky involves Damon Thayer, and Damon Thayer lives in Scott County, and he's obviously a member of the establishment and a person who will do exactly what they're told to do by the establishment, is exactly the kind of person that somebody like Damon Thayer would want to get done. So let's take a look at 2020 and now 2022 for that race. So in 2020, Stevenson went up against Erin Yates. She won 51.5% of the vote. Turnout was 70% Democrat, 67% Republican. Registration numbers at the time was 20,945 Democrats to Republicans 21,422. 50% Democrat voters, 49% Republican voters turned out. So when you take their registration numbers and then their turnout, you end up with 50% of the voters turning out of the DR split were D, 49% R. So Stevenson did convert about 0.5% of Republican voters over to her side. She overperformed by 0.5% if we're just looking at party registration. In 2022, Stevenson wins with just 50.1% of the vote because of, once again, you had redistricting there, so she went down. Turnout was 48% Democrat, 45% Republican. Interesting that Democrats turned out higher than Republicans despite seeing statewide and R wave there. Very interesting. And that tells you that Sherilyn Stevenson herself may be running a good turnout campaign. Our registration, when we look at registration now, it's 15,488 Democrats to 17,029 Republicans. So that is with 49.2% of voters being Dem. Remember, they were redistricted, and it was given an R advantage when redistricted even more so. So that is 49.2% of the voters being Democrat, but she still won with 50.1%. So she got about 1% of Republican voters to cross over and vote for her. Now, a way she does this, by the way, in a lot of ways, and she did this to the gentleman who was running for that office. The gentleman who was running was a individual who had donated money to Kamala Harris in 2020. And it's something to do with frats, or I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But he donated money to Kamala Harris in 2020. So Sherilyn Stevenson attacked him on the fact that, and sent out mailers to Republicans saying that this guy supports Kamala Harris, this guy's a donor to him, don't vote for him. Well, if you thought that was bad, Vanessa Grossell is even worse. And so if Stevenson does execute attacks on that, and I believe she has, well, then what you're going to see is obviously people saying, well, look, I may do the same thing. I don't want to vote in that race at all because Vanessa Grossel is just a Democrat in disguise, which she is, and Stevenson has a lot of material in that way to mine there. So, but let's just take that out of it. Let's say that she converts 0.75% of ours to vote for her. That's midway between what she did in 2020, 2022. And with current registration, what it is, so assuming that the total vote for Stevenson would be 11,166 to Grossel's 11,475. So if all what we can glean from all the other races remains consistent, constant, average, Vanessa Grossel will win that race, but with razor-thin margins, which tells you this is a true toss-up. Now for all the money they're dumping in. On the R side, the D side has been dumping in some real cash-ola to make sure they hold on to this race. $182,000 alone in Stevenson's account, far outpacing Grossel's $40K. Plus you have the fact that frankly Stevenson knows and is willing to attack an R for being a D. I think it will be a close one, but I think that maybe Stevenson may be able to pull it out. She's got a lot going for her. Before the election, I'll have another show out on my podcast. So head over to theandrewshow.com to catch that. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you.